Most people think they know why Weimar Germany collapsed into hyperinflation, war reparations, a worthless currency. The government just printed too much money. But almost every version of this story you've been told is either dangerously incomplete or flat out wrong. The real collapse was triggered by a French army marching into Germany's industrial heartland and shutting it down completely. It was accelerated by a handful of industrialists who quietly got richer, while ordinary families watched their life savings evaporate overnight. It was worsened by a central bank that kept the printing presses running long after the warning signs, and called it patriotic duty, and it was exploited. At the exact moment the German mark hit its lowest point in history, by a failed painter who turned a wheelbarrow of worthless banknotes into the perfect symbol for a movement built on rage. In the next 10 minutes, we're going to break down the 5 forces that actually destroyed the German mark, and why the government just printed too much money misses almost everything that mattered. To understand 1923, you have to go back to January of that year. Germany owed France and Belgium enormous reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, payments in cash, but also in raw materials like coal and timber. By late 1922, Germany had fallen behind on those deliveries. France's response was blunt. If Germany wouldn't pay in coal, France would take the coal itself. On January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops crossed into the Ruhr Valley, the single most important industrial region in Germany, responsible for the vast majority of the country's coal and steel production. They occupied mines, railways, and factories directly. The German government in Berlin had no army capable of resisting this, so Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno chose a different weapon: passive resistance. Millions of Ruhr workers, miners, and civil servants simply refused to cooperate. They went on strike. They sabotaged equipment. They stopped the trains. And here's the part most explanations skip entirely: those striking workers still needed to eat. The German government made a decision that would define the rest of the year. It started printing money to pay the wages of people who, technically, weren't producing anything at all. An entire region's economy was being kept alive purely on freshly printed paper, with zero goods coming out the other end. This is the actual trigger point, not Versailles in the abstract, not Germany printed too much money as some vague character flaw. A specific decision in a specific month to fund a occupied region's resistance entirely through the printing press. While that region's industrial output, the thing that gave the currency any real value in the first place, dropped to almost nothing. Every hyperinflation needs a printing press, and Germany's belonged to a man named Rudolf Havenstein, president of the Reichsbank, the central bank. Havenstein wasn't stupid, and he wasn't reckless by nature. He was, by most accounts, a rigid and cautious career bureaucrat. But he made a choice in 1923 that economists still argue about a century later. He kept the presses running, faster and faster, framing it explicitly as a patriotic necessity, financing the Ruhr resistance, paying the state's basic bills, keeping the government functioning at all. Some historians go further, arguing Havenstein and parts of the German government saw hyperinflation as useful, a way to make Germany's reparations debt, which was fixed in gold value terms, effectively worthless in practice, since the real economy backing the currency was disappearing. Whether or not that was a deliberate strategy or simply institutional paralysis is still debated. What's not debated is the scale of what happened next. In January 1923, $1 bought around 18,000 marks. By November, $1 bought over 4 trillion marks. Banknotes were printed on one side only to save time. People were paid twice a day because prices changed by the hour. Workers would sprint from the factory to the shops the moment they were paid, because a loaf of bread that cost 3,000 marks in the morning might cost 12,000 by evening. This is the image most people remember: wheelbarrows full of cash, children stacking worthless bills like toy blocks. But that image, dramatic as it is, obscures who actually benefited from all of this. Hyperinflation is often described as a disaster with no winners. That's not true. It was one of the largest wealth transfers in modern European history, and a small class of people understood exactly how to use it. The most famous is Hugo Stinnes, an industrialist who had already built a substantial empire in coal, steel, and shipping before the crisis. As inflation accelerated, Stinnes did something simple but ruthless. He borrowed enormous sums of money in marks, then used those loans to acquire factories, newspapers, mines, and entire companies. By the time he had to repay those loans, the marks he owed were worth a tiny fraction of what they'd been worth when he borrowed them. He was effectively paying off massive debts with pocket change. By late 1923, Stinnes personally controlled an estimated 1/5 of German industry. He wasn't alone. A whole class of speculators and industrialists played the same game, buying real assets with borrowed paper money that was actively losing value by the hour. Meanwhile, the people with no assets to leverage, pensioners living off fixed government payments, families with savings in the bank, small business owners holding cash reserves, were wiped out completely and permanently. A lifetime of savings that might have bought a house in 1913 couldn't buy a loaf of bread by late 1923. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the standard explanation. Hyperinflation wasn't chaos that hurt everyone equally. It was a mechanism that moved wealth at incredible speed, from ordinary savers to people who already had capital and knew how to use debt. Here's why this matters beyond the economics. The group hit hardest by 1923 wasn't Germany's poorest. Many of them had little in savings to lose in the first place. It was the middle class: teachers, civil servants, small shopkeepers, retired officers living on pensions, people who had spent decades building modest financial security, following every rule, trusting the state's promises. By the end of 1923, that trust was gone. Not just their money, their belief that the system was fair or even functional. This is the group that historians point to again and again as the one most receptive, a decade later, to a political movement promising order, stability, and someone to blame. The hyperinflation of 1923 was resolved fairly quickly, at least on paper. A new currency, the Rentenmark, was introduced in November 1923, backed not by gold, but by mortgages on German land and industry. It worked. Inflation stopped almost overnight. But the psychological damage to an entire generation of the German middle class didn't reverse nearly as fast as the currency did. And this brings us to November 1923, the exact month the mark hit its historic low, trading at over 4 trillion to the dollar. In a beer hall in Munich, a minor political figure named Adolf Hitler, leader of a small nationalist party, attempted to seize power in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed within about a day. Hitler was arrested, tried, and briefly imprisoned. By most conventional measures, this should have been the end of his political career. Instead, the trial made him a national figure, and the trial happened against the backdrop of a country that had just watched its currency, and its middle class, effectively disintegrate in a matter of months. The putsch itself failed because of hyperinflation's chaos, not because of it succeeding. But the conditions that made Hitler's rhetoric land with an audience were manufactured, in large part, by the exact 5 forces we've just walked through: an occupied industrial region, a central bank's printing decisions, a small class of industrialists who profited from the wreckage, and a middle class that had just lost everything it believed was secure. So when someone tells you Weimar Germany collapsed because the government printed too much money, they're not wrong exactly, but they're leaving out who made that decision, who benefited from it, and who paid the price. 5 forces, 1 currency, and a decade later, one of the darkest chapters in modern history. If you want to understand how economic collapse actually reshapes political history, not the textbook version, the real one, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.